This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your host Carl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Wounded Knee, geography and greed on the road to an American massacre. And as with all the videos here at Geographics, this one is based on original articles submitted to us by a member of our team, this one being Ben Edelman, which I've apparently been mispronouncing this entire time. And on the subject of pronunciation and words I'm unfamiliar with, I did do some independent research prior to recording this video, specifically on the National Museum of the American Indian, and just to double check that American Indian, Indian, Native American, Indigenous and Native are all acceptable terms to refer to people who identify to those groups. However, as it states here, they largely prefer to be referred to by the tribe that they hail from. So I will endeavour to do that throughout this video unless I'm speaking generally or quoting / paraphrasing someone from a, let's be honest, less enlightened time. Yeah, there's some sensitive subject matter in this video, so anyone out there of an especially sensitive or nervous disposition, you've been warned. Let's get to it, shall we? The Indian Wars were supposed to be over in 1890. All of the tribes of the American West had been pacified by then, after all, and shipped off to live in reservations, the vast majority of their historic lands given over to settlements by whites. There were none left to oppose the implementation of the American system from coast to coast, the fulfillment of manifest destiny. But desperation can drive men to extremes, whether that desperation is caused by starvation or the potential loss of political power. This is what happened in 1890, both in Washington, on the plains of South Dakota, and combined with a healthy dose of that classic American combination, fear and bigotry, led to one of the most infamous events in American history, the Wounded Knee Massacre. On a cold December morning, soldiers of the United States Army killed some 300 men, women and children, many of whom were unarmed and simply trying to run away. The uprising they supposedly been participating in was in fact a fiction invented entirely in the heads of skittish Indian agents who neither understood nor sympathised with their charges. That didn't stop enthusiastic Americans, many of whom had never heard the real story, from celebrating Wounded Knee as a glorious battlefield victory over the, I can only apologise, I'm quoting someone from history here who is best off not remembered, savages for decades afterwards. Wounded Knee has been held up as a symbol of all the wrongs inflicted upon American Indians in 2 centuries of expansion, which continue to leave deep scars even to this day. But it is also a specific tragedy, the origins of which lay not on the Great Plains, but in the halls of power of the nation's capital. In 1890, the United States was rapidly becoming one of the richest countries on earth. A quarter century after the end of the Civil War, the country had staged a remarkable economic turnaround, fully embracing the Industrial Revolution to transform itself into a massive wealth-making machine. America was now home to more millionaires than anywhere else on earth, and the opulent mansions springing up in cities like New York were cited as examples of the country's growing prosperity. The fuel that drove the American economy was inarguably the West, the newly settled lands west of the Mississippi River, to be specific. The West was not only home to some of the most productive factories in the country, but that was also the source of many of the raw materials that those factories were turning into finished products. Iron ore, precious metals, timber, and of course, people. Every year, more and more miles of railroad track were laid, connecting the West with the rest of the nation. They were also gaining increased political influence as well. 8 new states had been created from the Western territories between 1867 and 1890. There was no longer a frontier. The West had indeed been won. But there was a dark underside to all the glitz and glamour of Park Avenue. All of that wealth was being created at the expense of other people. New immigrants toiled away in factories in the cities, putting up with abysmal pay and even worse working conditions, whereas former slaves in the South found their former masters had introduced a new system, Jim Crow, that relegated them to second-class citizen status. But no one suffered more in this economic system than the American Indian tribes, who had called the Great Plains their home for centuries prior to the arrival of the United States. The Indian Wars had ended in victory for the United States by 1890. All the bands that had resisted the encroachment of settlements and soldiers onto their ancestral lands had been forced to end the struggle, and all the tribes had been forced onto reservations that seemed to shrink more and more with each passing year as the choicest parcels were sold off to settlers. Read white people. One of the tribes hardest hit by the transition to reservation life was the Lakota, also known as the Sioux, whose traditional territory was primarily in the modern state of South Dakota. The Lakota had been a nomadic horse culture, following the buffalo herds that were the foundation of their entire livelihood, and the attempts to force them to adopt agriculture and a more sedentary lifestyle were, shall we say, not going very well. The chief problem was the geography of the region. In many parts of the Great Plains, particularly the Dakotas, turning the endless seas of grass into productive farmland was next to impossible, particularly in the days before the implementation of modern irrigation techniques. This was particularly true of the Indian reservations, since they were usually allocated the worst stretches of land after the more desirable parcels had been bought up by Whitey. The Lakota were in a no-win situation. They were no longer able to hunt the buffalo even if they wanted to, since over 90% of the herds of buffalo had been wiped out by that time. And the few crops they had managed to grow in that and the previous year had withered and died in the face of a relentless drought that had also wiped out the crops of many white farmers in the region. This left the Lakota almost entirely dependent on rations provided to them by the government, which was supposedly guaranteed to them in the treaties that had taken their lands in the first place. But in this respect, they ran afoul of one of the more odious political practices of the period, the spoils system. So buckle in, folks, this is not a fun read. So in the days before a professional civil service, almost all government jobs were political appointees, usually picked by the president himself. In 1890, as I hope we all remember from history class, the president was Benjamin Harrison, who was an enthusiastic proponent of what was known as the spoils system. The idea was that the government jobs could be used as patronage. Loyal party men who could deliver votes to the Republican Party were appointed not based on their qualifications for their position, but on how much they could stand to personally gain from the office. It was basically a reward and an incentive for past and future services to the political machine in Washington, and nowhere better demonstrated the corruption and inefficiency of this system than on the reservations. So the Indian agents appointed to the administration, who were supposed to oversee the delivery of these rations, were almost all wildly terrible at their jobs. They usually gave out the government supply contracts to their friends and relatives, usually receiving a handsome kickback in return. Meanwhile, tribes like the Lakota were delivered poor, inadequate rations of food and other supplies, and in some cases, never received anything at all. And I'm smiling here because of just, it's so bad. Like, it goes all the way around that the only thing you can do is just, you have to laugh because it's so absurd, like patently, like evil, that the only thing you can really respond to it is just by going, I can't believe it. It's like, so if people see me smiling or laughing here, it's one of both nervousness and just incredulity of just like how up things were back then. So I do apologise if anyone reads my responses or the way I'm presenting this as callous or not caring or flippant. It's just the only way I know how to cope. I'm British. I keep these emotions usually bottled up for good reason. And you might be wondering, well, surely they could have just complained, right? It's like, well, no, because back then, Native Americans couldn't vote, and since they didn't really have any power to influence Washington, nobody in Washington really gave a about them in return. As the winter of 1890 approached, the Lakota were starving to death on their own reservations, the victims of bad weather and government neglect. It's hardly surprising then that many of them began to pray for a miracle to deliver them from their dire situation, which is why so many turned to the ghost dance. The ghost dance began life as a vision of a Paiute religious leader from Nevada named Wovoka. Mixing Christianity with native religious practices, Wovoka claimed to have had a vision from God during the solar eclipse on New Year's Day, 1889. In this vision, God told Wovoka that Jesus Christ was going to be reincarnated in the personage of an American Indian, and that he would bring back with him all the spirits of the Indian ancestors that had died in the past. The ancestors would lead the Indians to good hunting grounds where all the vanished game, like the buffalo, would return. All the evil would vanish from the world, read white people, and all the faithful, living and dead, would live together in harmony forever. In order for this vision of Eden to come to pass, though, Wovoka told his followers that they needed to regularly practice the ghost dance, a slow, methodical dance conducted by a group moving in a circle, holding hands, while drums played and all present sang. The ghost dance was brought to Lakota in the spring of 1890 by two converts, Short Bull and Kicking Bear. And as the drought raged and the Lakota starved throughout that year, the new religion found many new converts. Almost from the beginning, the ghost dance alarmed the Indian agents appointed to the Lakota reservations. It seemed to them to be militaristic in nature. The Lakota version of a renewed earth free from all evil had all of the whites disappearing from Indian lands, never to return. Can you blame them? Which some alarmists claim was a call to violence. The agents, which you'll remember were all political appointees, broadly fell into two categories. Those who viewed the posting largely as a money-making opportunity, who had otherwise little to no regard or sympathy for the Indians, and those who wanted to reform their, and again, quoting people from a less enlightened time here, savage ways, incorporating them into American society by either encouraging or forcing them to adopt the ways of the white man, leaving their traditional culture behind. Either way, both groups objected vehemently to the ghost dance. In October 1890, a new agent named Daniel F. Royer arrived at Pine Ridge Reservation to take up his post and was immediately alarmed by the ghost dance. Royer, who was nicknamed, and I'm not making this up, Young Man Afraid of Indians by the Lakota, wrote numerous anxious letters to Washington, claiming that the dancers were fomenting an uprising among the Lakota and that he needed troops to stop them. His superiors, despite getting numerous reports that contradicted Royer's reports of a violent uprising, took the agent at his word. Harrison's administration, growing increasingly unpopular all over the country, but in particular in reservations for pretty obvious reasons, thought it was a good opportunity to garner patriotic support with a military victory. They sent in the army and a deadly chain of events was set into motion. So today's topic is a pretty heavy one and I wanted to take a break, so I'm here in my comfiest sweater. I've got a cup of cocoa and a stuffed animal, and I brought in my editor and co-host from FactFeed to talk about today's sponsor. So what is today's sponsor, Mr. Braddles?
Today we are sponsored by Squarespace.
I see, I've heard of this brand, so go on. We don't do ads much on FactFeed, so tell me more about Squarespace as I pet my anteater called Snoot.
Well, Squarespace is a website design platform.
I know that, yeah. You can design websites on there and stuff, yeah?
From what I can tell, it's very easy to use.
How complicated can you get stuff? Because I've never actually figured out how complicated a website can be.
I guess it depends on exactly what you want, but they've got a system built into it called Fluid Engine.
Okay, that's a really cool name, but okay, Brad, what does Fluid Engine mean? 'Cause that's the thing. It's a cool name, but what does it mean?
I mean, I think it's a fancy way of saying you can do anything you want with your website. They've created this system that's like almost like a grid, so you can drag and drop things wherever you want.
Is it not like, Microsoft Word or anything like that, where you drag a picture and it completely offsets all the alignment and stuff?
It all goes behind your text.
Yeah, is that all handled on the back end, I imagine?
Yeah, they've managed to solve that problem with the engine.
Well, tell me more about our today's sponsor, Brad.
Well, there's one aspect that might be particularly relevant to you, and that's if you ever wanted to teach a course.
Okay.
To educate people.
There's a couple of subjects that I feel I could speak to with some authority.
They've got the ability built into the website where you can upload lessons of a course.
Okay.
And then if you'd like to charge for the course, you have the option of doing it as a subscription service, or you can sell it as a one-time fee for access.
So if I wanted to create my own subscription service, which is me just sat petting my anteater drinking cocoa, I could make a website where you can subscribe for more videos of me doing this, yeah?
I mean, is that every episode?
Yeah. Petting my snoot. It's got this bit's my favourite bit. It's like when I used to shave my head and do you like the peach fuzz.
Do you ever flick it?
You got to flick, you got to do that.
Sponsor. Squarespace has got plenty of different tools that would help you with a course, or even if you set up a shop.
Let me guess, so you'd need stuff like the ability to set up mailing lists, actually take payments and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so you can obviously, we mentioned before, you can set up the various payment plans. You can also set up a mailing list, which means that you could send out email campaigns to people if you have an update or a a new product. And there's also an analytics page, which you obviously were familiar with as content
Very
creators.
familiar, yes.
Yeah,
I'm very familiar with analytics that trend downwards. Thanks, YouTube.
So you can use that to see where people are coming from to the website, and you can obviously use it to figure out how to improve how the website's doing and how your course is doing.
If any of that sounds interesting to you folks at home and you would like to register your own domain or get yourself a website, you can do so by following the links www.squarespace.com/geographics and using the code geographics to get 10% off your first order of a website or a domain. Have you had any experience setting up domains and stuff, Brad?
No.
It is an absolute pain in the snoot, so it's nice that there are sites out there that can make it easier.
Suppose we should get back to the video.
So yeah, it's going to dissolve back to me trying my best not to cry. Fun fact, I nearly cried making this video.
Really?
Yeah, nearly, yeah. All in all, the government sent some 9,000 troops to the Lakota reservations, which, for the curious, was 1/3 of the entire standing army of the United States at the time, and this marked the single largest military mobilization since the end of the Civil War. Keep in mind, there was 400 Lakotas there. They were commanded by Major General Nelson Miles, one of the country's most famous Indian fighters. Miles largely saw the situation for what it was. The discontent was caused by government mismanagement and widespread hunger among the Lakota, and the ghost dance was merely a symptom of this. He believed that if the government's treaty obligations were met, there would be no uprising. Yeah, don't go back on the thing you promised. Miles also hoped to wrest control of Indian affairs from the Department of the Interior to where he believed it actually belonged, in the hands of the military. So close. Initially, the troops found themselves with little to do. Instead of the Indian uprising they'd been promised, they were confronted with starving Lakota who were angry, yes, but they weren't preparing for war. They were just hungry. Then in December, everything suddenly went to hell. To the north of Pine Ridge was the Standing Rock Reservation, home to perhaps one of the most famous Lakota leaders, Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull, long viewed as the symbol of Indian resistance to the United States, was not a ghost dancer, but many of his followers were, and he refused to tell them to stop. So Standing Rock agent James McLaughlin decided to have him arrested, claiming he was fomenting discontent among the Lakota. Early on the morning of December 15th, 40 Indian police, led by Lieutenant Henry Bullhead, arrived at Sitting Bull's cabin with orders to detain him. While they waited for Sitting Bull to get dressed, a large number of his supporters surrounded the police, angrily shouting at them. As the police attempted to force Sitting Bull onto a horse, one of his followers, Cash the Bear, stepped up with a gun and shot Bullhead, who responded by immediately shooting Sitting Bull. A gunfight broke out that would leave some 16 dead, including both Sitting Bull and Bullhead. The botched arrest sparked very real fears among the Lakota that the whites were coming to massacre them all, and members of Sitting Bull's Hunkpapa band fled to the camp of Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, long recognised and influential peace chief. Spotted Elk had been invited by other Lakota leaders to come to Pine Ridge and use his negotiation skills to broker peace between the two sides, but because his band left their camp without permission, they were mistakenly labelled as hostile by the army, which was nervous of reprisals in the wake of Sitting Bull's death. There were an estimated 360 Lakota travelling with Spotted Elk, 120 men and 230 women and children. They were intercepted by US troops on their way to Pine Ridge Agency on December 28th and brought to a campsite on Wounded Knee Creek. It was a low-lying, flat area that offered little protection from the freezing cold temperatures of the harsh South Dakota winter. Meanwhile, the soldiers surrounded the Lakota on all sides, placing 4 small cannons on a hill in position to fire down on the Indian camp should anything go wrong. Spoiler, things went very, very wrong. It was clear from the very start that the soldiers were both afraid and contemptuous of their captives. After all, they were members of the 7th Cavalry Regiment who'd been famously defeated by Sitting Bull at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, resulting in the death of their commander, George Custer, along with many of his men. Many of the regiment's officers had served under Custer, while most of the men were inexperienced raw recruits with little actual real-world or battlefield experience. They were nonetheless raised to fear and distrust Indians based on lurid tales of various atrocities committed during the Indian Wars. On the morning of December 29th, the 7th Commander, Colonel James Forsyth, sequestered the men from the women and demanded that they be disarmed before he would take them to Pine Ridge. This was begrudgingly done, but Forsyth was dissatisfied with how few weapons had been turned in. After all, this was a marauding band of hostile Indians planning to murder innocent settlers, right? There had to be more guns somewhere. And admittedly, some men were hiding guns, but that's because, to the Lakota, long guns were objects held in high esteem, and losing them, especially without being paid or compensated for the fact that you've just lost your gun, was a huge blow to the man's dignity and his livelihood. And there are 2 conflicting stories about what happened next, and both concern a man called Black Coyote. And 2 things for sure are known about Black Coyote: that he was deaf and that he was in possession of a very new, very expensive Winchester rifle. So the first story is that Black Coyote simply didn't hear or understand the command to disarm, since he didn't speak English and was incapable of hearing anyway. The second is that Black Coyote did understand but was unwilling to give up his gun without being properly compensated for it. Either way, fair. What happened next, though, is altogether more clear. A couple of soldiers spotted the gun and began wrestling with Black Coyote to wrest it from his grip. And at some point, the Winchester discharged harmlessly into the air, which didn't really matter. This was like a signal to the 500 troops surrounding the Lakota, who almost immediately began firing into their captives. Their first volley cut down many of the Lakota men and also hit their own soldiers, since they were poorly arranged in a circle, basically shooting at each other. Again, poorly trained raw recruits with no real training or experience. The Lakota fought back, but since most of them had already been disarmed, they were at a distinct disadvantage, and more than half were cut down before they could even grab a weapon. The cannons began firing on the encampment, and the women and children inside understandably fled for their lives, pursued by the soldiers who, according to testimony, went wild and shot at every Indian they could see, combatant or not. The cavalrymen retrieved their horses and rode down the defenseless women and children, shooting them down in cold blood. Some bodies were found as far away as 3 miles from the camp, evidently having been chased all that distance by the soldiers who just wanted them dead, shot in the back and left for dead. Others were found in the teepees, which the soldiers walked among, shooting anyone they found, hiding or cowering inside, which included Spotted Elk, who was sick with pneumonia and could do nothing to defend himself from the attack. When it was over, 290 Lakota lay dead at Wounded Knee, many of them old men, women and children. 50 more were wounded, and the soldiers suffered 31 dead and 33 wounded, many by their own hand. While the soldiers carted off their dead on the very same day, the Lakota victims were left lying on the field for 3 days, by which time a heavy blizzard had blanketed the area in snow and frozen the corpses solid, which were buried in a mass grave. At least 4 babies were found alive during the recovery operation, still clinging to their dead mothers. Now, I get this is very important. Now, I didn't know this. I was only vaguely aware of Wounded Knee. I was kind of aware like it was a horrible massacre, but it's when you learn the details. It's the the devil is in the details. And it's very true in this case. It just that image is so harrowing, and I just need a second. I did this script twice, and the first time I nearly cried. The reason why is a friend of mine just had a baby today. I picked a fun one. This is the first video I'm doing today, so if you see me with like red eyes in any upcoming Biographics or Top 10s videos, you now know why. General Miles was furious when he arrived on the scene in the wake of the massacre. He blamed Forsyth for the disaster and immediately relieved him of command. Good. However, the whole incident would end up being whitewashed by the government, who buried all reports of there being a massacre at all, restoring Forsyth and christening the incident the Battle at Wounded Knee, which I think we can all agree is wildly inaccurate. The 7th Cavalry, instead of being labelled murderers, were seen as heroes, with 19 of them receiving the Medal of Honor, America's highest medal for bravery and gallantry. For many contemporaries who didn't know the full story, Wounded Knee was a just revenge for Custer's death at Little Bighorn. They believed wholeheartedly that the Indians had shot first and that the army did not deliberately target non-combatants, i.e. women, children, the elderly and the infirm. It would take decades to dispel the falsehood from the American consciousness. Wounded Knee effectively ended the so-called Ghost Dance War. By January 15, 1891, the military concluded operations in the area and went home, leaving carnage and trauma in their wake. Many Lakota became disillusioned by the ghost dance in the wake of the massacre, and those who did still practice it did so in secret for what we hope are obvious reasons. No one was ever held officially responsible or punished for the deaths at Wounded Knee, and despite multiple calls to have the Medals of Honor that were awarded that day revoked, this has yet to be done. Beginning in the 1960s, America began to reevaluate the period of the Indian Wars through a more critical, less jingoistic lens. Widely read works such as Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee told the story from the Indian perspective, which had up to that point been largely ignored in favour of portraying them as cartoonish figures prone to savagery, instead of, just people trying to live their lives. The Army's treatment of Indians was compared unfavourably with the ongoing Vietnam War, with Wounded Knee in particular being compared to the infamous My Lai Massacre of 1968, when soldiers murdered between 300 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The site of the massacre at Wounded Knee has been preserved as a National Historic Landmark. The Lakota view it as a symbol of all the wrongs committed against them and regularly commemorate their fallen ancestors on the anniversary of the massacre, December 29th. The site became infamous once again in 1973 when it was the scene of the Wounded Knee incident, a 71-day armed standoff between the American Indian Movement, or AIM, and the federal law enforcement officers. AIM was protesting the autocratic rule of tribal president Richard Wilson, as well as the US government's persistent failure to fulfill its treaty obligations with American Indians. The incident eventually left at least 2 dead and over 15 wounded. As a result of the media attention paid to the Wounded Knee incident, the US government has made some effort to rectify the wrongs committed against the American Indians by their predecessors in recent decades. However, those who live on the reservations in South Dakota continue to live a much lower quality of life than the average American. At Pine Ridge, where the massacre took place, more than half the residents live below the poverty line. There are few employment opportunities, the infant mortality rate is sadly 5 times higher than the national average, and they have the lowest per capita income and life expectancy of any place in the entire United States. The massacre at Wounded Knee is a national shame for most Americans today, as it realistically should be. A shocking mix of bad government policy, the whims of geography and weather, and mutual fear and distrust on the part of both Lakota and the soldiers put Spotted Elk's band and the 7th Cavalry on a deadly collision course that day in December. It is important to acknowledge and remember Wounded Knee, not only to honour the victims, but to ensure such an appalling instance of government-sanctioned murder never happens again. As noted at the start of this piece, I'm aware some very sensitive subject matter is covered in this video, so yeah, thank you for sticking with us, and it feels like we do videos like this every now and again. I'm not too comfortable doing them, as it's probably clear. I feel weird doing the calls to action at the end of like, comment, subscribe, so just imagine that I said them. Otherwise, I'm going to go now quietly reflect on the nature of humanity and weep a little for the part of my soul I lost researching and recording this. Cheers everybody, and as always, have the day you all deserve.